Hi, everyone. We're going to get started now. I'd like to welcome you to the first ever live ACEs webinar, Integrating Neuroscience into Counselor Training and Practice. My name is Dr. Eric Perry, and I will be serving as the moderator for the webinar. Currently, I'm the social media coordinator and web manager for ACEs and a clinical faculty member at Southern New Hampshire University. Our presenters today are Dr. Tom Field, Dr. Laura Jones, and Dr. Chad Luke. As a reminder, only the presenters' microphones will be active, but you're welcome to place comments in the chat box. If time allows, the presenters have asked that you enter your questions in the chat box, and they will select questions at the end of the webinar, again, as time allows. After the webinar concludes, you'll need to complete an evaluation form sent to you by email to receive your CE confirmation, email, and certificate. Please keep in mind that you'll need to retain both the email and the certificate to submit both for documentation. If you have any questions regarding the webinar, please feel free to send me an email at socialmedia@acesonline.net. For those of you who are interested, a recording of the webinar will be made available in the ACES webinar library within 1 week of the presentation airing. So without further delay, I'm going to turn over control to our presenter, Dr. Tom Field. And we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, do you see the PowerPoint okay there, Eric?
Tom, you are good to go. We can see the PowerPoint here on screen.
Okay, great. Welcome everyone to this presentation about integrating neuroscience into clinical practice and training. My name is Dr. Tom Field. I'm an associate professor at City University of Seattle. I'm also the WASIS president for this year, the Western region, and I am the chair of the American Mental Health Counselors Association Neuroscience Interest Network. I also help out with the Journal of Mental Health Counseling. I'm the associate editor of the Neuro Counseling section of that journal. And I just joined board with Counseling Today's Neuro Counseling Bridging Brain and Behavior column. So we're very excited to share with you this presentation about some of the research that we recently have completed and are writing up currently about integrating neuroscience into clinical practice and training. And I'll let my co-presenters join me in introducing themselves.
Thanks, Tom. This is Laura Jones. Came into counseling very much with a background in neuroscience, interest and continued passion for how we as a field can best integrate neuroscience into the work that we do, both in education and supervision and clinical practice, has followed me and only grown this in the years that I've been in the field. I'm currently an professor at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. Helped to start the ACES Neuroscience Network back in 2013 and 2014. Helped to start the Counseling Today Neuro Counseling Bridging Brain and Behavior column. And I work closely with these guys and several other folks in doing work in the field around this area. And I'm just really excited to have this opportunity to talk with you all today. So thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Chad Luke. I'm out at Tennessee Tech University in Cookeville, Tennessee, a rest area basically between Knoxville and Nashville, if you're not familiar with the area. So I'm an associate professor here. Came to know Laura a few years ago, I think, right, Laura? Through the Neuroscience Interest Network through ACES. Yeah,
and, probably back in 2012, 2013.
Was it?
Yeah, it's a long time ago.
Oh, this was a long time ago. But then Laura and I started working together on an earlier version of this survey, some of the research that we're talking about today. And part of that was related to ACES 2015, I believe, in October 2015. We were on a panel. I guess I was moderating, and Alan Ivey, Lori Russell Chapin, Lucretia Dye, Rayson Miller, Sean Hall, and Laura Jones were there. And we had used the survey to generate some questions about this topic. I was finishing, I think, the Neuro for Counselors book at the time, and led to some really productive discussion and got a sense of how people are interested in this topic. And so then a little while later, talked to Tom and Eric about maybe working together. Tom had been interested in this area as well. So pretty excited to be here with you guys today. Wish I could see your faces, but glad you can't see mine. So happy to talk through this with you today. So thanks for having us.
Great. Thanks, Laura and Chad, for introducing yourselves and sharing a little bit too about the background to the research that we did. We'll talk a bit more about that as we get into methodology next. So we, as Chad mentioned, there was a survey study that they had put together in 2015, a pilot survey that had a sample size of about 77 people. And we looked to modify that for this current survey based on the responses that we had and current input. So for an example there, we transformed some of the qualitative questions that were asked actually by Laura and Chad in 2015 into quantitative questions by looking at what the themes were and responses and putting those themes into a kind of a select all or select as many as are applicable kind of question format. And that gave us more statistics on how people felt relative to the questions we were asking. What else did you both want to share about the initial survey that you had developed in 2015?
I think at that point, and Chad, feel free to jump in, I think you and I were discussing the panel, trying to get that sorted out, wanting to generate some questions from that panel, and just realizing at the time that there was absolutely no baseline work or research in terms of what people were actually doing. We knew that there was a brewing interest in this area, and we were starting to get more and more questions about it, but really just wanting to have a better understanding of how people understood what it meant to integrate neuroscience into counseling, some of what they were doing, how they were getting their training. And so it was a really great opportunity to be able to work with everybody again to revise the survey so that we can see to some degree, at least a little bit of some of the trends too, once we go back and compare some of the earlier results, to see some of those trends in the field and the growth in the field in this area as well.
Yeah, what stood out to me, Laura and everyone, was sort of the question that sort of dogged Laura and I in our work together in our conversations and in listening in and participating in the ACES Interest Network was, and it led to the question that we heard from people, from counselors everywhere on the survey, is what does it even mean to integrate neuroscience into counseling? We don't even really know what that means, and trying to come to even a consensus statement about what that looks like. So we were really starting at ground zero, taking baby steps throughout that. So that sort of informed kind of where we are now with this work. So the instrument pilot survey was initially developed in 2015, and as we mentioned, we revised it in 2017 and sent it out to a large amount really of counselors, supervisors, counselor educators. We used both convenience and snowball sampling. So an example of convenience sampling, we sent out the survey to some popular listservs that people may be familiar with. We also sent it out to some of the lists that were fairly new within the past couple of years that had developed around neuroscience interests within the counseling profession. And we also sent out the survey link to some faculty members at universities to share with their fellow faculty and students. That was more of an example of snowball sampling. So we use a variety of techniques, and because of that, the response rate is really impossible to ascertain. There's no way of knowing exactly how many people received the survey and responded. We did have a large sample size as a result of that, though. We had about 450 people, close to 460 people who responded to the survey. And I think that lends some interest in terms of the trends that we see for counselors, for counselor supervisors, and counselor educators.
The design of the survey was an embedded mixed method survey. We used both qualitative and quantitative questions, and there were some questions that had an embedded feel to it too, where we would ask a quantitative question and then a qualitative follow-up, such as, can you expand on your answer? The procedure that we used was basically, again, to send out invitational emails to multiple forums. We also used social media, tried that out, and passed that through IRB first, of course. And we didn't have many responses on social media. We had about 15 to 20 responses. Most of the responses came through the emails that we had sent. Is there anything else you both think we should add about methodology before we move on?
I don't think so.
I think that sounds great, Tom. Just for sake of time, I think that's perfect.
Okay, sounds good. Let's move on. So we're looking at some basic descriptors of the sample. It was overly represented by women, by females, about 75.8%. It tends to look fairly typical with how, if you send out surveys to counselors in general, what the composition is, but we should mention that we do have an overrepresentation of females. We had some counselors who, and counselor educators who identified as transgender or non-binary in addition to male. And in terms of race or ethnicity, the vast majority were white. We had, unfortunately, a large overrepresentation of white respondents, about 83.5%. And I think to some degree that, you have to think, well, maybe this could be slightly overrepresented as a sample, and then maybe the findings aren't, quite as replicable to other groups. And so that's one of the limitations of the survey results that we had. Is there anything you both think we should add there to gender and race or ethnicity?
Sounds good.
Okay, let's move on. The average years of experience were interesting. Our sample was fairly experienced, though there was a large standard deviation. So we had close to 10 years of experience as the average for the sample. The median was about 5, and the standard deviation was large at about 11. The rationale for that, though we have yet to dig further into the data that we think, is because we had quite a large number of students who responded who had relatively little counseling experience. We also had people who responded who had 40 years of counseling experience. And so there was quite a large range that you see there, and that may account for why the variance is quite significant there.
Tom, if I can add one thing on that side, sorry, I'm just gonna, I think one of the things that this is also representing is something anecdotally that we've seen in a lot of presentations, and the feedback that we've gotten through the interest networks and so forth, is just that there is a really considerable growing interest in this topic and in this area among our students, both master's and doctoral. Our survey captured more of the master's student perspective, but there is, I think it reflects that interest and that growing interest among our students.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of education level, we had mentioned that there were quite a few students in this sample. You see there about 27% current master's students, about 13% current doctoral students. But the largest group were current practitioners, people who had graduated with a master's degree, were not a doctoral student, and were practicing counselors. That was, as you'll see later, that was a far larger group than counselor educators. In terms of which of the degree programs integrated neuroscience, this is a question that we asked respondents in terms of their own training, not necessarily if they were counselor educators training others, but their own training. You'll see there that the numbers are quite low, that only about 40% of counselors had any degree of neuroscience integrated into their program at the master's level, and about 15% at the doctoral level. In terms of professional activities, most of the respondents were members of a professional association of some kind, close to 87%. You'll notice there that people were members of ACA, ACES, ARMCA. ACA was the most common. And in terms of licensure, about 70% were licensed or credentialed, and about exactly 50% were licensed as counselors. You'll notice there that one quarter, a sizable amount, were also board certified by NBCC as national certified counselors. One of the things we want to point out here too is that there's a bit of a misnomer or a misperception out there that neuroscience is really the bailiwick of psychologists and most interesting to them. The sample did not have many psychologists within it. Only 11 people who identified as psychologists responded to the sample. So we're mostly looking here at counselors and counselor educators in the sample. You'll notice here just one further thing, that there's a specialty credential within the world of biofeedback and neurofeedback called board certified in biofeedback or board certified in neurofeedback. And there were a few counselors who were certified in that way, but it was a fairly small amount, about 3.3%. I think we should mention, though, that that's a growing interest in the field, too, an interest in biofeedback and neurofeedback. Wouldn't you both say?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I would say across all mental health fields, actually, and I don't think that's unique to counseling. I think just in general, bio and neurofeedback have a growing interest within mental health.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that based on my experience with counselees or students in counseling programs and doctoral programs.
Okay, I want to try to get through some of these slides about demographics. I think it's important to understand before we get to the main topics that we're looking at here in terms of how neuroscience is being integrated. So briefly, counselors were practicing within the past year. About 2/3, just slightly over 2/3 of the sample were practicing in a community setting. And in terms of academic work roles, I'd mentioned that there were less counselor educators represented here. Only about 17.5% were full-time faculty in a counselor education program, part-time faculty about 11%. And you also had some people responding who were, for example, counseling center directors. But overall, only about 1/3 of the sample had any form of academic work role. And for those who were in academia, most worked in a KCREP accredited program. In terms of the area of specialization, we found this interesting. Most identified as specializing in clinical mental health counseling. You also had a sizable number of people specializing in trauma, and often those two kind of big concept areas, neuroscience and trauma, they interact in a lot of different ways. And I think people who work with trauma often are interested in the neuroscience of trauma. And so it made sense to us as to why people specialized in trauma and responded to this survey.
Tom, I'm going to jump in.
Go ahead.
Yeah, never mind. You're going there.
Yeah, I think you'll go in the same place I am. Just that addictions and child and adolescent counseling were both also of interest, and of course those areas also tend to be ones in which neuroscience is very applicable.
I just want to, if I could just jump in here real quick, you guys. One of the areas of low participation or low specialization, career counseling, partly because of low enrollment in career counseling as a specialty in KCREP programs across the nation. But also, I don't think that folks really see a connection between career counseling and neuroscience. And that's a part of my dual career path, including career counseling. And I think there is a role for that. And I think the demographics really speak to how we're not really sure where this fits. We're pretty sure it fits in clinical setting with mental health, with trauma and addictions. But I think it's a good opportunity for us to ask broader questions of application, not to recklessly apply it to every area that's possible, but to ask some good questions about how might it bolster other specialty areas. For me, it would be bringing back career counseling as real counseling related to social justice. So just had to throw in a soapbox there. So thanks for not muting me while I was saying that.
Yeah, career counseling. The other thing that was interesting, Chad, too, was to me was school counseling. You know, there's this idea that neuroscience is really only of interest to clinical counselors, but you saw here just over 8% of the sample were identified themselves as school counselors. And I think that's important too, because often school counselors do have a role to play in, for example, neuroeducation or helping people understand how the brain and body work.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, so next we asked about theoretical approaches that primarily directed the work that people were doing in relationship to counseling. CBT was the most common, person-centered the second most, solution-focused the third most. Was there anything that stood out to you both about these numbers?
I think for me, when I think about this, I think those are some of the ones that you see most in our field, just in general. And what I find interesting is when you look at some of the theoretical approaches in line with how individuals, and we'll get to this later in the presentation, but how individuals are currently integrating neuroscience and how they wish to integrate neuroscience in the future. And I think you start to see some themes and some overlap there as well. I think there's also some other areas. For me, one of the ones that I'm really interested in is how neuroscience can integrate pretty seamlessly into a lot of Gestalt therapy. And so there's, as Chad was mentioning a minute ago, as well, I think there's a lot of ways that we can, as a field, start to broaden our perspective of neuroscience and have a better understanding of how it can integrate into some of these other approaches, into some other training areas. And yeah, so I'm trying not to get too far ahead in what I'm going to talk about later. So
I feel your pain, Laura, because I wanted to just ask participants to just sort of put a pin in that person-centered is the second largest representation, because that'll be something that I'll talk about a little bit in a few slides about a potential conflict, but an area of opportunity for us to work through the integration of counseling, neuroscience into counseling.
yes.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chad. Yeah. The other thing that I'll add to what Laura's saying is that if you look there at interpersonal neurobiology, you know, that's one of the theories, more modern kind of theories, that it's more of an applied theory based on some neuroscience concepts that tends to be associated with neuroscience a lot. So when people think about whether or not I use neuroscience in my counseling practice, they'll think about theories like interpersonal neurobiology. You had relatively few people saying that they used that in their work or that it directed their work. And far more people identified more common theories such as CBT or person-centered or solution-focused. And like Laura's talking about, I think we're now getting to a place where we're thinking, okay, how can neuroscience inform what I currently do as a counselor rather than I have to take on a totally new theoretical approach? The next slide was of interest to us because we wondered how people were getting training in neuroscience. And you'll see there are three kind of peaks. One was conference educational sessions, one was webinars or online trainings, and the other was journal articles. We found it interesting that the most common was conference educational sessions, followed by journal articles and webinars. And you can see there that there's clearly a need for training at conferences, and at the same time, it's interesting that that is as common, if not slightly more common, than journal articles. Was there anything you both wanted to add to that?
I think in some ways this is depicting how, at least among, I'm trying not to overgeneralize, but among our sample, just how eager people are, and they're finding any ways they can that are readily available for them to get this training. I think one of the things to keep in mind is, as we're talking about some of these sources, ways that we can, as a field, attend to the consistency of the education that individuals are receiving in the field. And I think that to some degree, you know, is absolutely being done beautifully. And I think anytime individuals are getting most of their information from conference sessions or from webinars and trainings, one of the things that we just need to ask is making sure that all the information that's being presented in those is accurate and is up to date and is, and that's not any, and just to clarify, that's not anything about any presentation whatsoever, but it's just a larger consideration as a field, especially at this new kind of age in the integration of neuroscience, that we just need to keep in mind. Just maintaining the integrity of the work that's being put out and the training that's being done.
Yeah, I just want to, if I could, just echo what Laura said. Laura, I appreciate what you said, because it is the thing that we wrestled with for the last few years, you and I, and talking about how would you even approach standardizing training and information that's given. And we have standards of practice in other areas of counseling, but with this nascent field of neuroscience integration is kind of challenging. And one of the things as I was reviewing the data, the slides, you know, sort of the mixed blessing of getting to present this stuff is you're like, hey, we're getting some of this stuff out here, and then you realize, oh, we should have asked this. And I'm noticing that with journal articles, we didn't ask what kind of journal articles. And I think with the increase of applied counseling journals addressing neuroscience, I guess I would, and maybe we asked this and I don't remember, are counselors getting their, and counselor educators getting their information from sort of primary sources in the journals of neurobiological research, or are they getting sort of an applied distilled version from counseling journals that are addressing this? And that's just, again, that's not on against anybody's approaches, but it's just questions for us to ask ourselves as we move forward.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. And I think there's a slide coming up where that question becomes quite pressing, quite an interesting question. I think we're ready for our first poll, Eric. Would you mind setting up the poll? So I think the poll has just been opened, so everyone should be able to see that poll. Okay, so let's close the poll in just a few seconds. If you haven't responded, just take a moment and respond. Okay, and the poll is now closed. Eric, would you broadcast the results? Okay, I'm trying to see if I can. There we go. So the poll asked how you've accessed information about neuroscience, and you'll notice here that most people have said journal articles or print books, about 81% of people. Conference sessions is second highest at 66, and webinars at 49%. You'll notice very few people have attended specialized certification programs in neuroscience, and only about 15% in their own graduate programs. So I think that really reinforces what we've already found. It's interesting that journal articles are more common here than conference sessions. But I think in general that the trend seems to be people are getting their information from conference sessions and journal articles and webinars far more than they are for certification programs and graduate programs. That becomes apparent when we look at a slide coming up. Is there anything you both wanted to add there about the results of the poll?
No, I think that's great.
Yeah, thanks for participating in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Eric, if you could turn off the poll and return. Here we go. Okay. So next slide was, we asked people to perceive their current skills in integrating neuroscience. This one was interesting to me because you see almost a perfect pattern here whereby most people identify as being fairly novice, stage 1, and relatively few people stage 5 experts. And you see almost, you know, an almost exact kind of trend downwards, which you would expect. You would expect most counselors to say novice and fewer counselors to say expert, since we're, I would say, within the last 5 to 10 years, really only starting to dive into how neuroscience can inform our profession and inform our work as counselors. Yeah, anything else you both wanted to add before we move on to the next slide?
I think that sounds great.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Okay. So the next question we asked was whether neuroscience moves us further away or closer from the core beliefs and values of the counseling profession. Most people felt that it moved us closer towards our core beliefs and values. So you see there that around almost 80% of people felt that it moves us closer or much closer. There were some people who said neutral, at less than 20%, and very few people said moves us further away. So obviously the people who responded to this survey had if not a bias towards neuroscience, certainly a proclivity towards that it helps us as a profession. And I think it's interesting because it's hard to know whether counselors and counselor educators in general feel this way, whether this is representative or not. We did have a fairly large sample, but again, you wonder, did we have people respond to this survey who were more inclined towards neuroscience anyway? Sounds like some more research we've got to do, team.
I would say, too, if I could just add, Tom,
Yeah.
that these are survey respondent intuitions about moving us closer or much closer. I don't know that we asked what they meant by that. So I'm not sure how they saw that, just that maybe if it's a hope in that it moves us closer, or if they would point to some specific ways that it moves us closer. And that we're getting closer to some of my research interests here. So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the question to me is an interesting one because, if I think about what the core beliefs and values of the counseling profession are, for me, I mean, I could identify things like wellness, a developmental focus, a focus on prevention. And you'd hope that most counselors have that sense of what a core belief and value is, but that could vary somewhat between counselors as well, or among counselors. Next, we asked what neuroscience-informed approaches people were using in their counseling practice. This one was of interest to us, and Laura's going to take on this slide for us.
Oh, you're good to go. So one of the things that we were interested in, and kind of taking a step back, is how people are currently using neuroscience. One of the questions that preceded this question in the survey was carried over from the 2013 survey, and it was, essentially, what does it mean to integrate neuroscience into counseling? And so stemming from that, we asked individuals exactly how they were doing that. And some of what we saw, two of the most popular were the neuroscience-informed techniques, so techniques such as mindfulness and neuroeducation. And the interesting thing about these are things, especially with the neuro-informed techniques, these are techniques that we may already know outside of understanding the neurological or neurophysiological basis behind them. And the neuroeducation is one of those that we can take pretty directly from the science and be able to explain to clients. So I think to some degree, what we're seeing in this is representative of the knowledge base in the field. I think as that knowledge base continues to grow, a little bit of what we were talking about a minute ago in terms of shifting the perspectives of how we see neuroscience fitting into our profession and fitting into each of the aspects of what we do, I think we're going to see a growth in the use of neuroscience to inform our case conceptualization. So the use of neuroscience in terms of informing our theories and building theories from the counseling field that are based in neuroscience. So Chad, I know that there were a few things you wanted to add on this one as well.
Oh, sorry, I was listening so intently and thinking about some of our work. I think, yeah, there's a lot to say here. I'm going to just I'll wait my turn to my slide. I think you covered this really well.
Okay, I think there's one piece, and this will just allude to some of what you're talking about. I think, and what you may be talking about in the next couple of slides, but I think one thing to keep in mind is that right now people seem to be doing what they know to do and what's the easiest to do, which in some ways is good because it means that people potentially aren't taking the science too far and stretching it. So diluting the science, reapplying theories that are already applied to our field. And so some of this, I think, is actually representing pretty healthy growth of the integration of neuroscience into the profession.
Yeah, I think that's good, Laura. I would, if I could, I will just, I'll take my turn now if you don't know. I will add that I think when we see the bimodal age distribution or time in the field in the demographics of the survey, we see lots of master's and doctoral level students, folks who haven't practiced, and we see folks who have practiced a really long time. And I think in our conversations with folks, we've experienced that a lot of counselors are just really, who've been in the field a long time, are really looking for a way to energize their practice and infuse some new techniques, some new ways of thinking about work that they've been doing for a really long time. And we certainly would applaud that desire to innovate and create. And I think that's coming out in this a little bit as well in parts of the survey.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the number is very high. I mean, that's nearly 2/3 of counselors who are using some form of neuroscience-informed technique or neuroeducation. That's really substantial. And I think that speaks to how the field has dramatically increased its use and interest in neuroscience-related interventions. You notice here, too, that neuroscience-informed assessment and case conceptualization is far less frequent, much more infrequent. And I think that's important to look at as well, because counselors seem to be interested in using techniques, using neuroeducation, less commonly using theories, and even less commonly than that, using assessments. And that perhaps speaks to a gap that we could look at addressing in our educational programs, as well as looking at maybe if people are most interested in theories and techniques, or even just techniques in neuroeducation, how do we assist them to do that? You know, what kinds of education opportunities within graduate counseling programs, certification programs, conference educational sessions, what can we be doing to assist people who are already doing that in their practice?
And Tom, I'm going to jump in again real quick on here too, because I think part of this is for folks, even having, to some degree, perhaps, it might fit for some folks, that they may not have a very good understanding of what it would mean to do neuroscience-informed case conceptualization, so what that would look like. Or with neuro-informed assessment, I know one of the things that I've heard quite often is an assumption or a myth that requires some kind of fancy technology. And it doesn't. It doesn't. Just having the core knowledge of neuroscience can genuinely help to inform how you understand the struggles of your client and can shift the way you work with a client from that assessment forward.
That's a great point, Laura. Okay, let's move on. So next, we asked about ethical and multicultural concerns. Chad, do you want to take this?
Yeah, glad to. I am aware that the time is melting away, and I'm frustrated at the clock usually. So I'll try to address this quickly. But Tom and Laura, if you remember the structure of the question that I miss, please let me know. So we gave respondents a set of choices to choose from, forced choice selection, to identify what they think might be the biggest concerns in moving forward in this work. And they're listed here from highest or greatest frequency to lowest or less frequency. And you see, and what I would ask you to do is, as you look at these results, hold these in your mind as you think about the ways in the previous slides people talked about how they are getting their education and how they are applying this in their practice. And so we've got sort of 3 pieces of information to work with here. The but the counselors and counselor educators in the survey, the biggest concern was that we may overgeneralize findings and take less of an individualized approach to client care. And I sort of hear the echoes of the person-centered folks leading the charge in that, perhaps, not to imply that others aren't person-centered as well. Lack of neuroscience literacy followed closely at number 2 among counselors, resulting in reliance on non-research-based understandings. And this is something I talk about quite often, is how attractive this is in the field and how we can be very easily seduced by headline-grabbing articles or versions of research that are presented in pop culture that most of the time clients are going to have access to, and they're going to come in and they're going to ask us, so what about this? The third one, increased medicalization of the profession, really strikes at that core value of that concern does, at the core value of who we are as counselors. And so I take a lot of comfort in seeing how folks are responding, being able to kind of identify some of these things. Like the fourth one supports a Western medical model of highlighting illness rather than resilience, and then creates possibility of practicing outside of the scope of practice. So kind of an interesting distribution there. I think they could check all that applied, or I don't remember if their response was forced. If you guys remember that.
Yeah, there was no all that apply. They had to select individual items.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. Thank you. I just want to point out, and again, we don't have time to get into this, but a few articles that talk about how when counselors or helping professionals apply medical or neurobiological explanations to their clients or patients without that humanistic and holistic component that, like Haslam and Cavell in 2015 noted that client perception of self was deteriorated when they had a biological explanation for their depression, because it may have been applied in a less than humanistic way. Leibowitz and Altman in 2015 said that clinicians who used neurobiological explanations were viewed more as aloof, and so we would say this is probably down to individual differences of how this was applied. And then Leibowitz and on in 2014 talked about clinicians who when they explained to clients symptoms of social phobia or depression in neurobiological terms, these providers also scored less on empathy, lower on empathy scales. And so I think that it's great that we're seeing that folks are concerned about some of these areas, ethical and multicultural concerns, and that's an area that I'm most passionate about probably in this work. So I'll just see if there's anything else you all want to add before we get to the next polling question, yeah, we're close to that.
Chad, I'm just going to jump in really quickly. One of the things that I find really fascinating about these results, especially with the increased medicalization, and this supports the Western model, Western-based medical model. If you look at how individuals are using neuroscience currently and some of the ways that they're integrating it into classroom teaching, they're using it more around psychopharm, psychopath, and I think those uses in and of themselves are going to drive some of those beliefs in terms of how neuroscience is perceived in the field. And it is my hope that as we begin to broaden our understanding of what it means to integrate neuroscience, the ways that we're doing that, is that we're going to see that it genuinely does resonate with our true core beliefs as counselors and our unique identity as counselors, and that it is holding true to our perspective of resilience and of strength and of wellness. And multicultural and social justice issues above all else, actually. So that's my hope. That's my hope, is that it reflects some of how people are currently using neuroscience as well.
I think that's a great point, Laura. I think that our profession hopefully is moving to a space where we can see how neuroscience can inform approaches to wellness and developmental approaches, rather than just looking at, understanding illness and psychopathology. So next slide is about barriers that the individual and others faced regarding integrating neuroscience into counselor training and practice. This one was of interest to us for a couple of reasons. You'll see here, first you see a couple of the red circles. Those are the most common responses and the ones that I think were fairly predictable. Availability of trainings, cost of trainings, lack of colleagues to consult with, concerns with self-efficacy. We looked earlier, if you remember, about the degree of competency a person felt around neuroscience. What I also found really interesting were the blue circles. So cost of equipment, resistance from colleagues, employer institutions, the time required. I would have said those would have been fairly large barriers, but people rated those as lower barriers than the other pieces we talked about. I think, are we at our next polling question yet, or are we getting close to that?
I think we're ready.
I think we're ready. Okay, Eric, can you throw up our next poll question?
Okay, and so this is just the greatest barrier to neuroscience integration from your perspective is, and we'll give you about 30 seconds to complete that poll. So if you'll enter your response now. "30 seconds seems like a long time sitting in silence on a webinar, doesn't it? Take just a few more seconds. Okay, so Eric, we can go ahead and close the poll if you don't mind. And all right, thank you, Eric. Lack of models for integration. So between the two, definitely more lacking models of integration rather than having too many models of integration. And then a close second to lack of models is the density of neurobiological literature, and then other. Oh, I want to ask you what the other is. It's about 15%. So yeah, thanks for participating in that. So it sounds like people that are participating in this webinar are looking maybe for a framework for integration, defining what that means, and then how these things move together: counseling, identity, and neuroscience. And then equally important, wading through that dense literature. So thanks for participating in that. Tom, Laura, any comments on this?
I'm going to jump in on this one, if that's okay, because the density of the neurobiological literature always stands out to me. And I will endlessly get the question and always have of whether or not knowing the anatomy is important. And for me, my answer is always a resounding yes in understanding the base core anatomy and physiology. It's just having a good, solid understanding of it. And one of the reasons that I think that's important is because you are then able to read some of that neuro literature and have a better grasp of it. Because a lot of what our field is doing is taking that and translating it into what that means, and then hopefully taking that next step, which I believe we're starting to do now, which is conducting research to make sure some of those theories and some of the translational theories actually hold up. And so, yeah, I was just excited in some ways to see that as a barrier, just from my perspective of really appreciating the need for that base knowledge.
Okay, Eric, I think we're ready to switch back to the presentation mode. Thank you all for participating in the poll. Okay, we have to be sensitive to time here. Let's see if we can skip through these. So we asked people how they would like to integrate neuroscience in the future, ways that they're not currently doing that. And you'll notice here that there are a couple of things that we found interesting. The first was people did want to incorporate more biofeedback or brain-based kinds of interventions, more than half. People wanted to provide more psychoeducation, or what's called neuroeducation. That's Rachel Miller's term, nearly 60%. And also, you see this deeper understanding of psychopharmacology, which is interesting because I think when we think about neuroscience integration, often, like Laura was saying earlier, we think about psychopathology, psychopharmacology, and how it's integrated currently. And it seems like people want more information about those topics, even when that seems to be the predominant way in which it's being explored in cancer education programs. I want to briefly mention here that you see less people wanting to conduct research in neuroscience, and that's somewhat understandable considering that there was a fairly low number of faculty. About a third of the sample was represented by faculty. I'm going to skip to the next slide just for time. So you'll see here that faculty were integrating neuroscience into counselor education programs and much more often in the master's level curricula than in the doctoral level curricula. Almost 50%, not quite. And when we asked people how they were integrating, you'll notice that people were integrating into courses that are kind of anticipated, predictable. So you see there psychopathology, psychopharmacology, the trauma class, those are fairly common, the addictions class. But you also see some areas here that are possibilities for more growth. So if you're a counselor educator watching this presentation, there are some potential ideas you could think about integrating more neuroscience into your curriculum. One was counseling theory. That was fairly low, as was counseling techniques, as was human growth and development. And I think those three courses, if you look at what people are doing in practice, they tend to be using a lot of techniques in neuroeducation. So the theories and techniques courses seem to be important to look at in terms of integrating neuroscience. And then from a case conceptualization perspective and an assessment perspective, looking at integrating neuroscience into human growth and development also seems important.
And Tom, just really, really quickly on that one, some of those red circles are really exemplifying what I was talking about earlier in terms of how the neuroscience is being integrated and taught currently. And then also one of the others that I would say that I think is a very rich area for integration is the multicultural and social and cultural foundation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wholehearted agreement.
Yeah. And of course, poor old Chad, his career development course is only 2 people said they integrated neuroscience into career development, but maybe that'll change with time.
Yeah. I'm working on it.
I wanted to briefly also mention research and program evaluation. You see there are only 3 people, respondents said that it was being integrated into counselor education programs. And I think that's important when you look at the next slides related to the research domain criteria. That's the main criteria that the National Institute of Mental Health has established for evaluating grant funding opportunities and supporting research in the area of neuroscience. And you'll notice here that the majority of the respondents, they did not know about the research domain criteria. And if you look at how many people are using it in their teaching, it's less than 5%. So it looks like that could be an opportunity to an area that you could consider researching more, learning more about, integrating into your program, particularly if you teach research methods. The next few slides as we come to a close are important to look at. We're looking into the future now. We'd asked people for how they'd like to receive additional educational training in the future. And people talked about educational sessions, webinars, journal articles, as we talked about, but there were 2 other pieces that stood out to us here. One was certification programs. You notice this is quite high. Over half of the sample wanted a certification program post-masters in neuroscience. You'll also notice mentoring. About 42% of people wanted to be mentored in this area. And so if you're a counselor educator or working in a graduate program in counseling, those could be potential areas for growth. That don't necessarily mean integration across the master's curriculum, but more focused kind of areas of integration, though you could argue that mentoring could happen in the counseling curriculum as well.
Tom, can I jump in there really quickly as you move into the next slide? I think one of the important things to keep in mind is one of the things that I stress in this is how we can consider the sustainability of this growing interest in the field. And one of those is making sure that enough counselors and counselor educators are trained. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of people who have already graduated who are now coming back and saying, how can I get this information? So from my perspective, which is one of the things that I've been talking with people about for a number of years, is the importance of having a program like a certification program that can help those individuals who are potentially postmasters or even postdoctoral degree be able to get that additional training that they're needing without going back to an actual program of some sort.
Yeah. And you see here when you ask people about how best to train counselors, it's of interest. People think, well, integration across the counseling curriculum is the most effective, has at least the highest amount of very effective responses. Then you see certification programs as second highest and mentoring as third highest. You notice that the standalone specialized counseling course in a master's program, if you look at the very top row, that has a far lower rating for very effective, though people felt overall it was effective. So it tells you that people want integration across their curriculum, but they also want, as Laura was talking about, some form of postmaster's options for learning more about neuroscience when they're out of their program.
And I would just add, sorry, fast, that I think that low response on the standalone course is just in some ways is a recognition that K-Credit programs are jam-packed with courses, and the thought of adding another course feels onerous, if not impossible. But there's probably some conversation, and I think we've talked about this as a research group, the need to have a conversation around how do you get baseline information in the hands of students before you start integrating across the curriculum in order to handle this material ethically and responsibly. So, okay.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. Okay, we also asked people if they were members of the Neuroscience Interest Networks that currently exist for ACA, ACES, and AMCA, and most people were not members of a Neuroscience Interest Network. So it's just important to mention that our sample, you know, while they certainly had a proclivity towards neuroscience, they weren't necessarily specific members of an interest network in this area, and so perhaps the results could be generalizable outside of counselors just who are very interested in neuroscience. So a couple of summaries, and then we'll take questions. I know that we're kind of running close to time here. First, neuroscience appears to be increasingly integrated into counselor education programs. About 61% of counselor education programs have integrated neuroscience, and into clinical practice about 74% of the time. There are some concerns with using techniques without a deeper conceptual understanding, and reliance on pseudoscience and self-efficacy also appears to be a barrier. Within practice settings, neuroscience is more likely integrated into techniques or interventions than assessment and case conceptualization. Programs are more likely to integrate neuroscience into addiction, psychopathology, psychopharmacology courses, and there seems to be relatively little integration into theory and techniques courses, which is important considering that most counselors are using neuroscience-informed theory and techniques or interventions more so than assessment and case conceptualization. There's also an interest in integration across the curriculum. There's an interest in mentoring and an interest in certification programs that we mentioned. And many do rely on conference presentations or workshops in addition to journal articles. So we just need to make sure that our conference presentations reflect the most current literature and data when we're sharing that information about neuroscience. One quick thing before we take questions. Some of you are probably wondering about what kinds of extra resources could I look at if I wanted to learn more about neuroscience. Would you both share some resources you think could be helpful here?
For me, I think the interest networks are a great way to just connect with people and have those conversations. And especially I wanted to point out Eric, who couldn't be on the webinar today. He was our fourth co-author, co-collaborator on this.
Yeah.
And he recently started the Brainstorm. It's not only a listserv, but it's also a group that has a webinar each week. Those webinars are recorded. I think they just put them up on YouTube. And it's become a really, really awesome resource for people. And I think it's just a wonderful resource for the field to have. So I just wanted to point that one out especially. I think people are getting a lot from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you email any of us, we'll be happy to connect you with those resources about the Neuroscience Interest Networks or the Brainstorm listserv.
I would just echo both of those. I think they're fantastic. And as far as resources, I would just more of a general guidance, be aware of what you're looking for when you're looking at resources and what that resource is intended to do and its limitations. Because some of the resources are really theory-based, where they're sort of extrapolations from the literature on neurobiology and the brain and central nervous system. And some are more direct descriptions of those structures and processes. And so just being a good consumer of that information and recognizing that a lot of the stuff that's really popular is sometimes headlines taken from a few steps away from the original source material. And it's just sort of the questions you would ask yourself approaching any topic, from weight loss to graduate counseling programs. So.
And one other thing with that too is if you're in a position right now where you don't have access to a lot of trainings or to courses or what have you, I think one great way to start is just pick up an old school biology neuroscience textbook. I think they're a great way to get some base just information. And I think don't be afraid to do it. One of the things that I hear from people quite often is just that intimidation around it. But especially if you go back to the basics, get just your core textbook and just sit down with it and make friends with it. And just reading that information, I think having that framework will be incredibly beneficial for you moving forward to be able to understand some of the literature and just become more ingrained in what's out there.
Yeah, for sure. And if you'd like references, can people contact you, Laura? And you could.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
We're over time. We have one question. Maybe we can answer this one quickly and then we'll have to close. And please feel free to email us with questions if you have a question that we didn't answer today. So the question is, are counselors conducting research in neuroscience? The participant was not aware of this. They think most research is being conducted by psychologists and psychiatrists.
I think it is new, but I think it is most certainly taking a foothold. I think the interest in it is growing, and I think people are figuring out how that is possible. Some of the neuroscience research that we're seeing now is around neurofeedback EEG recording. There's some collaborations that are being built with functional imaging centers and so forth. There are individuals using techniques to build theories around neuroscience that integrate some of these concepts. So I think work is being done in that area. I think one of our challenges, and it'll perpetually be, at least for the foreseeable future in this field, is getting access to the grant funding, because some of this research is more expensive to take on. So as a field, enhancing and growing our reputation with some of the larger funding agencies to get some of the money that it takes to do this work.
That's a great point, Laura. And we mentioned the research domain criteria earlier, you know, because the National Institute of Mental Health really looks at that for funding initiatives. If you're interested in doing this kind of research, that's really something that you could look into, particularly if you're at an institution that has a history of obtaining large grants, federally funded grants, because that's really the pathway to get those kinds of funds to be able to do imaging research. That kind of research. Okay, I think we're at time, folks. Is there anything you both want to share as we close today?
I just, along with everybody who participated in the survey, I just appreciate everybody on today who is interested in this in some way or another, even if there are hesitations or reservations about it. I think these are the kind of conversations wishing it could be more of an interactive conversation, but the conversations that we need to be having around what this really looks like for our field moving forward.
And I would just echo that, and a shout out to ACES and Eric for putting this together, Tom for coordinating some of this, and Laura for they're just amazing work and letting me be part of that team and sort of leading the way in this area. So grateful to all of you, and for those of you who participated today, thank you for spending an hour with us today.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
please follow up with us if you want after the webinar. We regret that Eric Beeson was not able to join us, and we will look forward to hearing from you and continuing this conversation.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes our webinar. Everyone take care.